Hello, everyone. Welcome to this video. Um, if you're watching this video, you are probably taking either a literature course from me, whether it's world literature or English 102. So the purpose of the video today is to kind of give you a foundation as far as thinking about the study of literature as a discipline. And it's important to do that because you don't want to just read literature just to consume it. In a way, that's how what literature is meant for. It's meant to be a form of entertainment. But in a class like this one, we're teaching you how to critically think about a text. And by text, it might mean something like a movie, a video that you might see on YouTube, a commercial, even a literary text. So to kind of so what I'll do first is I'll first explain like how do we come up with the discipline of literature. Then we will talk about the different schools of thought of literature and how you might find yourself fitting into one of those schools. So to start us off, I will start by showing you guys this handout. Give me a moment. Here we are. So the word literature comes from a Latin word. I mean, literare. And the word literare means letters. Okay. I might have to correct that spelling. But literare means letters. So, what does that mean per se? So, you might think of that could mean anything. Anything written with letters is literature. That's where the word literature actually comes from. And so that could be a court document. Maybe you would find something like a court document from 1350, right? You discover that is that literature. Well, that's not necessarily something you would read in an English class, right? Maybe you find a letter. Um, sometimes you read letters in literature classes. If you take a course in American literature, the first 100 or so years of that is nothing but reading letters and diaries and things like that. One of the great pieces of literature that we can think of in the 20th century is the diary of Anne Frank, for instance. Um, what about newspaper articles? Is that literature? Well, we think about newspaper articles being kind of bland and generic, right? That's how journalism often is. But sometimes there's great pieces of journalism. So, but traditionally, you guys probably think of literature in terms of novels, short stories, poems, um, maybe famous essays, that type of thing. Those are the things that you read in a course like this. But perhaps you could even extend that out to some nonfiction. Like today, there's a popular genre of writing called literary nonfiction. Um, Nonfiction pieces that are written in a literary way. We're going to read a couple of things in um, English 102, Walden and Modest Proposal, which are both nonfiction pieces. But biographies, you could probably say a biography or an autobiography can be classified as literature. So The question is, how do we get this field of study, and how do we classify things as being a literature? Well, traditionally, the study of literature really took off, and I mean, it's always been there, but it especially became what it is today in the time period of 1940s and 1950s. This was when the baby boomer generation started, well, not the baby, started being born, and the greatest generation started going to school on the GI Bill. And that was probably the biggest time period in American history as far as the boom of higher education. But in the 1940s, 1950s, the field of literature took off. During that time period, literature scholars didn't really want to bring in politics or economics or anything like that into the study. The reason for that is they wanted to avoid being accused as being communists. You guys might recall from your history classes that was the Red Scare, um, the days of Joseph McCarthy's Senate Committee on Un-American Activities. So, if you took a course like this in the 1940s, 1950s, all you would do would be talk about literature in terms of things like symbolism, metaphor, um, personification. You would use those types of like literary terms to talk about literature. But in those days, they thought of literature as something timeless, something that stands the test of time. And to understand it, you don't have to know anything about the history or the context or anything like that to get it. It stands the test of time. You can read it in a vacuum. People 2,000 years from now can read this piece of literature and they'll say, you know what, that speaks to the human being, the human condition. So, some of the things that we might read in some of my classes, you can certainly say that about. In my World Lit 1 course, we study things from the ancient Greek period. Well, we're still reading them today, thousands of years later. So 2,500 years later, almost 3,000 years later for some of it. So you can certainly say it stood the test of time somehow. These are works that have themes that are universal to the human condition. And oftentimes with great writers like Homer or Shakespeare or Milton or Dante, like the great writers, that's often a claim that's made about them. Well, the study of literature has since taken off. In the 1980s and 70s, there was a bunch of new different schools of thought that emerged. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. But when those schools of thought emerged, new definitions of literature started springing up. Before, in the old school definitions, you had writers like Shakespeare, Milton, Dante, but notice that most of those writers were dead old white guys, right? So, especially in the 70s and 80s, a movement started that kind of broadened the canon out. So, you started seeing a lot more women writers being included in the study of literature. Before that, a lot of the women writers throughout history were not studied much. And during those time periods, lots of writers became widespread and famous again. You had a greater attention spent on, especially in American studies, on um, African American literature, Asian American literature, Hispanic literature. So you started getting more voices kind of put into the what we call the canon. You had in British literature, you had the study of post-colonial literature, which looks into the problem of colonization. So the study is expanding all the time, and writers that may be popular today may not be popular 20 years from now within the study. Famously, I like to tell this story in the antebellum American years before the Civil War. One of the most famous American writers was named William Gilmore Simms. He was a famous adventure novelist from South Carolina. Um, if you guys have ever seen the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, a lot of people love that movie. If you've ever seen that movie, that came from a story called The Partisan that he wrote. But Simms sold more books than almost anybody in antebellum America. But today, nobody reads them. If you go back and read his books, they're still fun reads. Why do we not study them today? Well, I told you not to generalize, but I told you guys he was a South Carolinian in the 1850s. He was very much an advocate of slavery. So, and a lot of those types of viewpoints show up in his books. So that's one reason why we don't really read them today. On the flip side, during that time period, a writer who sold almost no books, Herman Melville, he wrote what we would think of today as being one of the greatest pieces of American fiction, Moby Dick, about the white whale, right? Well, during Melville's lifetime, he only sold about 1,000 copies of that book. Just think about how heart-wrenching that would be to put so much of your soul into writing something so majestic, and just to have nobody appreciate it. Didn't make any money off of it. Melville actually died in the 1880s working at the docks in New York City. He did not make a career as a writer because he just couldn't make a living off of it. So that work became rediscovered. You have works like Kate Chopin's The Awakening, or the works like The Yellow Wallpaper from women writers that are still here, but they were rediscovered at certain points. So the study is always expanding. So something that I always like to do whenever we have live classes, I like to have a debate. Like, what would you consider literature? So, for instance, would you consider something like Twilight literature? Would you still consider something like 50 Shades of Grey literature? Depends on what your definition of literature is. If you say literature is letters, then perhaps you could include it. If you say literature is something that stands the test of time throughout the ages, arguably not, right? If you say literature is something that impacts the culture, the larger culture, then certainly, right? Think about how much those two books have influenced our culture. So it's a fun thought. The field is not something concrete. It's something we're always redefining. There's some things that are kind of concrete about it, like Shakespeare will always be literature. Dante, Milton, those guys will always be literature. But even now, even with that, there's a study to kind of move. There's a movement to kind of move away from those traditional writers to broaden the voices of the canon. So now let's take a look at my handout and look at the different schools of thought regarding literature. So this is my handout, and depending on what class you're taking with me, I'll tailor the handout accordingly to match the certain class. This particular one is for 102. I usually teach Gothic fiction in English 102. But so to start us off, a biographical approach. So these are all different. This is very much going to be a simplified lecture. You can spend a whole semester doing nothing but studying these various schools of thought. But this is very much a simplified way of looking at it. But think about these different schools as a lens that you're looking at literature. So each one of the lenses shows you something different and adds different types of meaning to whatever it is that we're reading. The first approach is, of course, called biographical. When you do a study like this, you spend a lot of time, especially thinking about the writer. What was going on in the writer's life to cause them to write this fiction in the way that they did? For instance, a novel that I often like to teach is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Well, Frankenstein is a novel about a mad scientist, bringing a dead corpse to life. But during the writing of it, young Mary Shelley, who was writing the novel when she was close to 18 years old, she suffered through a miscarriage. She was also a young mother. Well, in a book about a monster that was created without the influence of female reproduction, perhaps there's some link there between what was going on in her life and what's going on in the text. Sometimes, depending on the class, this is easier said than done. If you're taking a class in like ancient literature, oftentimes we don't know much about the writer at all. Like whenever we think about like Homer's The Iliad, we don't even think Homer was actually a real guy. Like we think that that's just a name put on that story as a writer. Whenever we get, so we know more about some writers than others. And there's actually a word of warning within literary criticism to kind of divorce the writer from the text. So even if the writer said, I meant to make my poem mean this, even if they say it, there's a movement that kind of suggests that the text stands on its own. The text means what it means. It doesn't matter what the original writer's intention was. You can kind of even think about how that applies to even stuff like law today. Within constitutional law, there's a debate about should we read the Constitution literally, take it at face value? Should we look at what the founders intended? Or should we look at the Constitution as a living, breathing document that we can interpret differently depending on the time we're living in? So you can kind of see how important that is. How much do we put emphasis on what the author's intention was? Excuse me. Disability studies is the next one. And these next a couple of these schools are a little bit more political in nature, and this is certainly one of them. The disability studies looks at the discourses surrounding disability in literature. So maybe within literature, you see somebody with some type of like physical disability, or maybe a mental disability. How is that character treated? How is that character characterized in the literature? What types of stereotypes or negative attitudes does that character convey? How can we learn how to create better discourse about the disabled by reading these stories? Well, you would be surprised how often this one comes up in my classes. To use Frankenstein as an example again, the monster has a lot of physical disabilities. So, mostly deformities. So, what does the treatment of the monsters have to say about how we treat people with physical deformities, for instance? So, the school's a little more complicated than that, and I'm not a expert. But if you ever notice something going on with the body, the human body, how is the human body being depicted? How is it being characterized? It's something that maybe focus a little bit more time and attention on, and spend a little bit more time and attention on it, and think about what the writer might be doing with that. The next one is called ecological studies. For this one, it's the same idea as disability. It's a little bit more political in nature. It's meant as a school. It's meant to be activist. It's meant to be used for you to read literature in a way that will help the environment in a way. And oftentimes in literature, nature is a character. So, for instance, in some early American literature, nature is usually depicted in two ways. You'll see it as depicted as this like Eden like paradise, and you'll see it depicted as this vast, scary wilderness where everything's out to kill you. Well, what is the writer trying to say about nature and how we treat nature? How do we seek to dominate over nature? Usually in Christian traditions, the Christian view of nature is man as the steward over nature, that God gives Adam that responsibility in the book of Genesis. But even if you read um, some modern theory, like post-humanism, or even literature from other cultures, like maybe India or China or something like that, they often view nature in different ways than we do in the West. So, how are animals depicted in literature is another interesting question within the school. So, this is very much one that is very much in vogue right now. This is a very popular school of thought. There's a lot of new scholarship being done on it. So if you notice nature, animals, how is nature being characterized? How is it being painted? Something to think about as you read. A formal approach to literature is what I was mentioning earlier in the lecture about scholars in the 1940s, 1950s. This is when you use literary terms to talk about literature. So oftentimes, like for instance, you would look at the rhyme and meter of a poem. Whenever you talk about literature, you might ask, okay, why did the writer pick a certain word? What are the themes? What are the larger ideas of literature? Um, and oftentimes, these types of exercises ask you to analyze passages and do close readings of passages. We don't have the study of literature today without the formal study. The study back then was called the New Criticism. Today, if you write a literature paper, you always have to give textual support for whatever your argument is. And just make sure I'm still recording. The textual support comes from the text. So even if you're doing any of these other schools, you're still doing a formal study. The only difference is today we don't typically tend to just do formal studies. Formal studies is integrated within all these other ones. Gender and race, this lumping these two categories together is probably problematic. But with gender and race, so with gender studies, you have what we traditionally call the feminist criticism of literature. How are women depicted in literature? Are there enough women voices within the field of literature? That school of thought has certainly produced new writers for us to study. Especially how are women depicted? Um, what types of gender roles and stereotypes does the literature perhaps support? Or how does the literature overcome those old stereotypes? Um, Within gender studies, you also have what we call queer theory. You might be shocked that I said that. Isn't that word a nasty word? Yes, it is. You don't ever want to call somebody queer, right? But the reason why it's called that is because of the LGBTQ plus community has taken that word that used to have a negative association and they've made it into a positive word. And oftentimes it's used for the study of sexuality in literature, especially sexualities that aren't heterosexuality. Oftentimes in literature, if you have, especially if it's older literature, um, things like homosexuality are not often, the author just doesn't flat out come out and say it. Oftentimes it's kind of spoken of in these coded ways that you kind of got to figure out. For instance, oftentimes if somebody is with a same-sex partner, in some of these stories they might call them their friend, for instance. Their good friend, I guess you could probably say. Um, but some, depending on what culture you're studying, this might be more prevalent than others. In the ancient Greek culture, it was widely accepted. But by the time we get to like the Victorian era, the British lit in the 1800s, certainly frowned on. But depending on the cultural mores of the time, it's something that you might focus in on. Oftentimes, with queer studies, it kind of intersects over with other studies. Like nature is sometimes depicted in what we think of as queer ways. Um, so, gender studies can kind of bleed over into other fields of study too. And race is pretty self explanatory. And of course, in the American literature tradition, the specter of slavery still looms large over us, right? And the types of racism that have come from that. But if you look at British literature, this bleeds over into post colonial. British literature are often, so the British colonized most of the world. Like there's an old saying that the sun never set on the British Empire. Well, so oftentimes in British literature, you'll see writers depict these other cultures in ways that make them seem overly simplistic. So look at these. So, for instance, look at these poor people from India and their beliefs. Aren't they? Aren't isn't that cute, right? Um, we British clearly do it better, but look at them. Look how behind they are. Like it kind of takes that sort of holier than thou attitude, like they're better than them in some way. Even if the writer is trying to be trying to be nice, it's not nice at the same time. Um, Lots of times the British will take these stories from these other cultures and add British twists to them. Not just the British, even in America, the study of Native American literature is influenced by this because lots of Native American literature was passed down through oral storytelling. So today, when we hear things like Native American creation myths, uh, it's filtered through a colonist's lens. So we don't get those stories straight from the horse's mouth per se. We get them from a colonist who kind of perhaps probably filtered some of the stuff out. So depending on what class you're taking with me, we might read some of this. If you're taking 102 and reading Gothic, you'll certainly encounter this. World Lit, the specter of colonialism is there. So probably more so in the World Lit 2 rather than 1 course. And then we have influence studies. So as we read through different stories in our class, you might think, okay, how did an earlier writer influence a later writer? To kind of do that, you oftentimes have to show that the later writer actually read the earlier writer. Sometimes that takes biographical evidence. But sometimes you can just assume too, but the writer probably read it. Psychological approach is probably the most popular. Lots of times the students who take these courses love psychology. Whenever you think of the study of psychology today, oftentimes the psychiatry and psychology have kind of split in many ways. Um, Classic psychoanalysis comes from thinkers like Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan. In classic psychoanalysis, you kind of have to talk out your issues and see like what types of what kind of trauma happened to perhaps cause certain behaviors and issues. And if you can kind of get to the root of what, if you can yourself kind of come to the root of what's causing your problem, that almost becomes an epiphany moment as soon as you realize what that moment was. Then you can kind of heal and get better from it. Compare that to psychiatry, which is more about the study of chemicals in the brain. The brain is a complex organ. What could go wrong with how the brain functions? Perhaps the brain's not releasing enough chemicals or too many chemicals. So the old school psychology is mostly what the field of literature deals with. So we'll often look at characters or even um, a larger society, a sort of larger setting, and kind of psychoanalyze them. And we oftentimes do those with Freudian or Lacanian vocabulary. So, for instance, Sigmund Freud, the famous psychologist, he's often called the father of psychology. He had a theory called the Oedipus complex. And Freud pretty much invented the study of early childhood development. But in the Oedipus complex, Freud suggested that when a young male child is just an infant, the child grows an overbearing attachment to his mother. And when I say overbearing, I mean overbearing. Freud insinuates that the attachment is almost sexual in nature. Well, when the father figure comes into the picture, the child realizes that that overbearing attachment to the mother is taboo. That's when a wall of sorts comes up. There's a limit to this relationship. And that's when, that's the first moment in a child's life that's traumatic. Well, it just all goes downhill from there, right? You can reverse that for women and their fathers. Like, without a, the girl grows an overbearing attachment to the father, and the mother kind of comes in to show them that there's a limit to the relationship. So, and Lacan's a whole different story. I could spend a whole class just talking about him. Lots of times we'll look at characters and we'll ask questions like, okay, what's going on with that character's psychology? What's causing the character to act that way? Um, we'll oftentimes ask questions like, is a character good or bad or evil? Um, were they born that way? Was the evil caused by the society that they lived in, or were they just born evil? So we'll oftentimes in my classes we bring a lot of psycho- folk psychology into the mix. And the last one is social, political, cultural. So the study of literature and the social sciences go hand in hand. So by social sciences, I mean things like history, economics, sociology, all that stuff. If you've taken those other types of courses, you can bring it into the study of literature. So you might look at a historical issue and then you use that historical issue to look at literature. That's the type of critic I am mostly. Um, I did my dissertation on um, the medical profession in the 19th century. During the 19th century, the medical profession underwent a lot of changes as far as whether or not doctors should have to go to school to get to be able to practice medicine. You think to yourself, why was that an issue? Well, in the 1820s and 1830s, they thought that you didn't have to go to school to be a doctor. They thought that school was just um, something that the elite people went to. They thought that anybody, as long as you had the knowledge, you could practice it. Well, I looked at literature and how literature examined that issue all throughout the century. So I could probably be a little more in deep depth about that, but that's just to give you an example of like what one social, political, cultural study looks like. So if you have an interest in um, social sciences and literature are very close cousin disciplines. So that should be it. As far as stop my share, that should be it as far as the basic overview goes. It's a little more fun if you can do this in person. That way we can discuss this stuff. Hopefully, I've given you guys something to think about. So don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions. And I hope this is helpful as far as reading your very first piece of literature in my class. So good luck and Godspeed.